Story 1. This takes place a few years ago. I live in Vermont and was flying to Houston to celebrate Christmas with my then fiance's family. He had actually left a few days prior and had wanted us to travel together. Unfortunately, I needed to finish up some work and I didn't want him to miss his family time. If you knew my job situation, you'd understand. It's not really relevant to the story though, so I'll just cut to when I got to the airport. I was flying from Burlington International to JFK and then to George Bush Airport in Houston. My flight from Burlington was scheduled to depart at 10 a.m., and then I'd have a 2-hour layover in JFK around lunchtime. I'd be arriving at George Bush sometime around 5 p.m. When I got to Burlington, it was packed, just as I expected, and I had made sure to arrive well ahead of time. About 30 minutes before we started boarding, I was sitting in the waiting area with my headphones in, listening to something on Audible. It was then that I noticed a man take a seat next to me. I was annoyed at that, since there were other seats in this area, but I didn't say anything. Not that it really mattered, because he then motioned with his hands to get my attention. I reluctantly took my AirPods out and turned to face him. I saw that he was middle-aged, kind of skinny, and wore reading glasses. He was dressed in khakis and a polo, and he didn't have a beard, but wasn't clean-shaven either. He was mostly bald with just a bit of hair on the sides. He immediately stuck out his hand and introduced himself as Dan. I shook his hand and scooted back a bit in my chair. He apologized for disturbing me and then asked me where I was going. I thought to myself, okay, why would he need to know that? I told him I was heading down south to visit my family. I was expecting him to ask some follow-up questions, but thankfully he did not. Dan told me that he was flying out to the west coast to spend some time in the tropical weather, and joked that we were both going to warm places. I feigned a laugh as Dan seemed to be enjoying himself. In that moment, it was hard for me to get a read on him. I couldn't tell if he had some type of mental issue or if he was socially awkward, or possibly just nervous about flying and feeling like he needed to talk to someone before getting on his plane. I decided to ask him if I could help with anything, and he chuckled and said, "No, not really." I was like, okay. I expected him to continue the conversation, but he just paused and stared at me for a bit. That I found a bit off-putting. After what seemed like a minute, he told me that he needed to go to his flight, which was in another terminal. I thought that was pretty odd, as why he would be all the way over here if he had a plane to catch somewhere else. But also, why did he come up to me specifically? I still didn't know the answer to that question, but after a while I got back into my audiobook and just waited to start boarding. After the airline worker made the announcement, I made my way onto the plane and to my seat. I put my carry-on in the overhead compartment and sat down. Just as the plane started taxiing down the runway, I felt a sense that something wasn't quite right. I looked around, and about 5 rows up and more towards the middle, I saw a bald head in the top of a polo. I thought to myself, could that be Dan? As the plane took off, I tried to decide how certain I was that was him. I kept looking in his direction, and eventually he turned his head to the side. Yep, I was like 95% certain that was Dan. This then raised the question, why did he lie about where he was going? I still didn't know whether he had some issues, was socially awkward or nervous, or possibly all three. Though I'd be lying if I said I wasn't curious and wanted to go over and ask him. Though ultimately I decided to hold off. When we got off at JFK, that too was packed. I can't remember all of what I did, but I did get lunch at a pizza place at some point and went to a gift shop. I think I ended up getting a refrigerator magnet and one other item. About an hour before my next flight was scheduled to depart, I decided just to go on a walk around the terminal and take in the sights. A few minutes into it, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. Almost on cue, I looked behind me, and about 20 feet back was Dan. Insanely creepy was the fact that he was looking right at me. Even more so, he had a smirk on his face. I really wanted to punch it, and I thought about confronting him then and there. I'm still not sure why, but I again decided not to. Finally, we were about to board, and so I took a seat in the waiting area. I cautiously scanned my surroundings for Dan, and sure enough, he was sitting a few rows over, and looking at me, and with that same expression on his face. This time I did walk over to him, out of annoyance but also out of curiosity. I think he saw me approach because he averted his eyes and pulled out his phone. When I was close to being in front of him, I realized that I hadn't planned out what I wanted to say. So as cordially as I could, I said, "Fancy seeing you here." Dan looked back up at me and gave a faint smile, but he didn't say anything though. After a moment I continued and said, I thought you were headed to the coast. Again, he said nothing. We both knew I had trapped him in a lie, but I still had no idea why he lied in the first place. Did he get off on this kind of stuff? A few seconds later, Dan just looked back down at his phone, seemingly ignoring my presence. I debated whether or not to continue to probe him, but I decided I didn't want to cause a scene. Therefore, I took another seat several rows away. After sitting down, I looked back up, and of course Dan was looking right at me. This time, though, his expression was more angry, and it genuinely freaked me out. Eventually, we boarded the plane, and sure enough, I saw Dan get up and start to go through the doors to walk down the ramp. In my mind, I was trying to think of all possible scenarios. It occurred to me that maybe I had met him before, or he knew one of my friends, and they were just trying to mess with me. Overall, that didn't seem likely, as this was way too elaborate and creepy of a prank for anyone to pull. I got in my seat, and thankfully Dan couldn't be seen from where I was sitting. Cut to when we got off the plane. My fiancé was waiting for me at the gate, and we exchanged a hug and a kiss and started to walk back to his car. I told him about Dan, and he seemed pissed, but ultimately there wasn't anything either of us could do about it, or at least it seemed that way. On our way out of the building, I took one final glance around us. I jumped back as I saw Dan about 20 feet behind us, but this time he wasn't walking. It seemed like he had come from further back and now was full on sprinting. My fiancé turned around just in time for Dan to try to tackle him. It didn't actually work though, as my fiancé easily fended him off. He pushed Dan back and he almost hit the floor. I don't think either of us knew how to handle the situation. It was just so unexpected. I was thoroughly creeped out by Dan before, but I still hadn't expected him to get physical. After a second or two, Dan regained his balance and began walking quickly back into the crowd. He pushed a group of people away to do it, who commented on how rude he was. And that was the last we saw of Dan. Thinking back, my experience with Dan is the creepiest thing that ever happened in my life. I guess that makes me sheltered, but I'm just glad, I guess. There were so many questions I had, like who that man actually was and why he singled me out. Was his name really Dan? Why was he traveling? Was it just so he could try to attack me? I don't think I'll ever know, but I do kind of watch my back now. Luckily, I've never run into him ever again. Story 2. I'm sure plenty of people have been in a nerve-wracking situation for a few hours, but I've got one that might take the cake. Without going into unnecessary details, my job requires me to go on flights pretty regularly, and this particular evening I was flying from Nashville to Chicago. I'd be in the air for a little less than 2 hours. I was a bit tired and hoping to actually fall asleep on the flight, which is very luckily something I can usually do. Unfortunately, absolutely no sleep was had, and you're about to learn why. As I was sitting in the waiting area at Nashville International, a man randomly came up to me. I flinched a little when I noticed him, as he came within about 2 feet of where I was sitting. He was tall, wearing ripped jeans and a ripped black t-shirt, and his arms were covered in tattoos. He looked to be about 20, and he had jet black hair that was slicked back. After locking eyes for a second or two, I asked the man if he needed something. I didn't like the fear coming through in my own voice. The man just laughed and threw his head back a little. Then with a sudden intensity, he looked back at me and said his name was Pablo. Then he said that he and his 4 friends were in the marching band, and that they were trouble for me. He again laughed and then promptly turned and walked away. I was both freaked out and dumbfounded. I just sat there, trying to process what just happened. From what little interaction I just had, it didn't make sense. Did I know Pablo? No, I'd never seen him before in my life. Did someone put him up to this? I had a few friends that might play practical jokes on me, but never anything like that. The theories I considered most likely were that one of his friends dared him to say that he was making some kind of prank video, or that he had mental issues. After a minute or so, I looked around the waiting area. I hadn't even been paying attention to where Pablo went. That's when I spotted him, about 5 aisles away, indeed sitting with 4 other men. They all looked to be about the same age, and they didn't seem like people you'd want to mess with. My heart sank as I realized they were most likely flying together. I considered getting security involved, but I wasn't sure they'd be able to do anything. It would just be a he said she said, and something told me Pablo and the other men would deny it. I ended up doing nothing, and everyone got on the plane. When I sat down, I noticed I didn't see them anymore, which made me feel more comfortable for the moment. Needless to say, I was still freaked out, and any hope I had of getting some shut-eye soon vanished. All throughout the flight, I kept trying to think of who those men could have been, and why they had apparently singled me out. When we landed, I started to become anxious. As I left the plane, I looked around, terrified that I might see them again. I kept looking as I got into the terminal, and when I still didn't see them, I decided to book it. I didn't like that the airport wasn't as crowded at this time of night, and as I moved around, I didn't stop looking. I didn't go straight to the exit either, rather I kept moving around, occasionally taking random turns. At one point though, I did have to use the restroom. I went to the closest one to where I was walking at the time, stood in front of a urinal, and did my business. There was no one else in this particular bathroom, including in the stalls. I know because I leaned down and checked. As I was finishing up and washing my hands, my stomach sank and my blood ran cold as I heard a familiar voice laughing loudly outside the bathroom door. It was Pablo, and this time he was talking to a few people. I assume it was the men I saw with him earlier. What happened next was straight out of a horror movie. I overheard someone ask him, "Do you think he knows?" Followed by, "I don't think so, bro." One of them shushed the others, and I felt my life flash before my eyes as the door flew open and Pablo and two of his friends rushed inside. One of them grabbed my chest and another put his hand over my face. He also held up something in his other hand, though I couldn't see exactly what it was. I knew I had only one option. I opened my mouth and bit his hand as hard as I could. He screamed, and I did the same. At this point, Pablo and his friends backed off and looked at each other for a few seconds. Then they all ran out of the bathroom. Luckily, this story has a good ending. Apparently they were apprehended by security guards and a police officer moments after they started running through the terminal. And when I came out of the bathroom soon after, a security guard was already about to come in. I explained the entire situation, including how Pablo had come up to me before we boarded the plane and how I had been trying to lose them by walking around after we landed. I decided to press charges. Pablo Castillo, as his name turned out to be, had a history of armed robbery and aggravated assault, among other charges. His friends weren't good people either, and I think all but one of them ended up with jail time. Looking back, they had to be pretty stupid for trying that inside of an airport, especially post 9/11 and COVID. Pablo also used his real first name, and I still have no idea why he said he and his friends were in a marching band. Maybe they thought that would be confusing? I really have no idea, and I'm just glad that I was okay and justice was served. It just goes to show that anything can happen when you least expect it. Story 3. Let me start by saying that this wasn't necessarily terrifying, but it was creepy and hands down the most bizarre thing to ever happen to me in my life. At the time I was 23, and I'm a professional kickboxer. I was actually on my way to a tournament, and I could handle myself inside and outside of the ring. Sometimes guys seem intimidated when I mention that, and I never had to defend myself in a situation. That is, until one day. The flight would last about 5 hours, and as I took my seat, I saw a huge, overweight man making his way towards me. He looked to be about my age, though obviously he wasn't physically fit. As he got closer to me, I was soon greeted by the stench of his body odor, and judging from the reactions of people around me, they were too. My heart sank a bit as he sat next to me, with part of his middle section spilling over the armrest. Now I don't want to make it seem like I look down on people, 'cause I don't. From the way this guy looked, I assumed he had some kind of condition, and some of my family members do too. I just want to paint the picture. Anyhow, I didn't expect what was about to happen. After he sat down, I couldn't help but notice him watching me. I had instinctively turned away, but I couldn't ignore it forever. He had on a blank expression, and that was the creepiest part, at the time anyway. While I consider myself extremely outgoing and not afraid of eye contact, this was entirely different. I returned his gaze for a moment, smiled, and asked him what his name was. But then to my surprise, he just stared back, not saying a word. This seemed to confirm my suspicion that he had some kind of mental issues, and after a moment I looked back to the seat in front of me. While the stewardess made the safety announcement, I grew increasingly uncomfortable waiting for him to stop staring. But strangely, he didn't. He still had the same blank expression and still didn't utter a single word. At this point my heart sank further, and I almost didn't want to believe that he could keep this up for the entire flight. After the plane took off, I pulled out a book from my carry-on and started reading, or at least, tried to. It was super hard to concentrate with him staring at me. After we'd been in the air for about an hour or so, It struck me how odd it was that this man was traveling alone. Like, if he wouldn't or couldn't talk to people, then how did he get to the airport and then get to where he needed to be? For a moment I thought that maybe his caretaker was sitting somewhere nearby, but since I didn't see anyone else talk to him, I considered that less likely. A little while after that was when things got unbearably annoying. I thought I imagined it when I started to hear a low buzzing sound. Instinctively I looked at him and noticed that he was exhaling through clenched teeth. And you guessed it, he was still looking directly at me. He kept making that sound too, only stopping once every 10 seconds or so to take another breath. The people in front of me actually turned around to see what that sound was, and one even shot me a sympathetic glance. 30 minutes later, and I couldn't take it anymore. I asked the stewardess if I could please move to another seat, and the stewardess, who was aware of the situation and heard this buzzing sound, quickly agreed. They moved me 3 rows up and over to the window, where thankfully the person sitting by me was normal. I stared out the window for a while, then continued reading my book. Eventually we were served dinner, and I'd started to put the man and the sound he was making out of my mind. All of a sudden I noticed the woman sitting to my right look up at someone who had walked over next to me. It was the same guy from before, and unexplainably he was still looking right at me. He wasn't making the sound anymore, but his teeth were still clenched, and his expression was blank as always. At this point I was thoroughly creeped out. Not afraid, mind you, but creeped out. I also didn't know what to do. I didn't want to get physical because obviously we were on a plane, and like I said, I think he had mental issues. But I also wanted to get the guy to stop. Eventually the woman next to me turned to the man and told him something quietly that I couldn't hear. The man didn't move away though. Then a stewardess came over, and after a few seconds she asked the man to return to his seat. He didn't do that immediately, but eventually he did. Like, how was he even able to get on the plane? Finally we were landing, and I felt relieved that I could get as far away from him as humanly possible. It was at that point that I remembered I hadn't actually moved my carry-on, meaning I'd have to go back and get it. And wouldn't you know, that man was still sitting there, eyes locked on me. After the plane landed, I didn't care though. I walked right back to my previous seat, looking him in the eye, and reached up to get my bag. But what happened next seemed so surreal. Right when I was lifting the cover of the compartment to get my bag, he full-on lunged at me. Like, I don't mean he bumped into me, no, he tried to tackle me. Luckily I overpowered him easily, shoving him off and back down on his seat. A few of the people around us screamed, and one of the guys in the row behind us actually reached around the man's seat and grabbed him. A stewardess came over, and a few minutes later 2 cops boarded the plane and came over too. It was a big commotion. Ultimately I didn't press charges, and really I wasn't really fazed too much. If anything, I was angry with whoever his caretaker was supposed to be, for letting him fly alone. I assumed that person would have known he could have been dangerous like this. Anyway, I don't know what happened to him after that. I saw he was escorted away by the cops, but that was the last I saw of him. Like I said, I wasn't scared, just creeped out.